Coming up as the NBA works towards the finals and ultimately the draft later this month, news around Zach Lavine and a willingness to basically salary dump his contract. It's a reminder of what can go wrong when you commit money in the wrong places, but also a curiosity as to whether or not Brooklyn should try to flip Ben Simmons. We get into it all coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/locked-on to get started. And Doug, long-winded cold open here because there's a lot of layers to the Zach Lavine onion in regards to the Brooklyn Nets.
Yeah, so it comes out that not too surprisingly, the Chicago Bulls are trying to get off the Zach Lavine contract, which just for the uninitiated has him making $43 million this year, $46 million in 25-26, and then a $49 million player option in 26-27. He's going to be picking that up, I think. So, and that'll be in his age 33 season. So, not surprising that the Bulls, who kind of ended the year better without Zach Lavine following an injury last year after sort of a trade deadline where it looked like they were trying to maybe move off the contract already, but then he got hurt. And so like that kind of submarined any of those plans if they were even going to be available. Now head into the offseason thinking about possibly salary dumping him with the little caveat that they might be taking pennies on the dollar or might not be able to move off of it all because teams just look at this and say, $49 million for Zach Lavine 3 years from now? No, thanks. And once again, example infinity of the cautionary tales around going sort of like max contract-ish money on guys who aren't max contract players.
Yeah.
And the bind it can get you into. And unfortunately, the Nets have a very similar contract on their books currently. Not as much money, but fraught with almost as much peril as Zach Lavine, and that's Ben Simmons.
Yeah, we know Ben Simmons obviously coming into the final year of his contract, so the Nets feel like they're about to get out from underneath a problem that they've been having. But even inside of that, when you hear Chicago talk about what they're willing to do with Zach Lavine, so much of that is the conversation that Nets fans had over the last couple of seasons with Ben Simmons. We'll go ahead, just, send him here, put him over there, trade him at the deadline. And it kept coming back to who's going to look at contract and go, oh, baby, if we could have that money on our books, that would really solve our problems. And with Zach Lavine specifically here, you meant about getting to the place where what team is going to look at him. I mean, over the course of NBA in the last, decade, when money's really gotten massive in some of these contracts, there are teams that always will look and say, oh, well, bad money for you can be good money for us, or a player that doesn't work for you can work for us. Zach Lavine right now represents the worst of both worlds. The team was better without him, and I don't know a roster out there right now that with the contract would say it's worth risk. Like, you have to account for injuries. You have to account for the money and whether or not you're going to be able to send out the adequate, whether it's picks or otherwise, to get him back. The plus side here, Chicago is basically saying, if you take him, we don't care. We need nothing in return. We just want to move on from him. Do you feel like it's going to be possible for Chicago to do that? Because this might be one of those, we always come back to, rare occasions of, what does the buyout look like? At a certain point, Chicago will say, we might pay you a lot of your contract just to not have you here anymore on this roster.
I mean, as with Ben Simmons, they're not buying him out. There's just too much time left in the contract. You would never, you'd be crazy if you're Lavine to buy it. Like, buyouts don't work in these cases. Like, I know everyone kind of defaults. I know you're not, but people default to like, oh, just buy him out. But remember, it takes two to tango on a buyout. Like, you need the team to want to buy you out, and then you need the player to accept a buyout. And players like this, and buyouts always come at less money. So why would you ever do it? I wouldn't. Name me a situation where you would just take less money just to go do whatever. You just wouldn't do it, especially when it's $50 million 4 years from now or 3 years from now. There's like a very few situations that it could work. Like, you look at Philly and you're like, okay, could he be a good third piece next to Maxey and Embiid? and they overpay a little bit there, but everything else in the roster is super cheap, right? Because they have like nothing on their books. Could it work in that situation? It's a close call. Short of that kind of situation, it's really hard to be able to see any team willing to go this direction because, like, I mean, the stats are, I mean, it's clear as day. Like with Lavine on the court last year, almost 900 minutes, the team was a -6 net rating. With him off the court, they were basically even for 3,000 minutes. So it's just like he didn't help them. Now, can he not help any team if he's the third creator and it's like there's a clear pecking order for him? Sure. But again, like you're in such dire straits because remember, when you're pushing 30 years old and you're already a reclamation project and that's very expensive, it's like unlikely to get so much better, right? It's actually much more
Wait
likely
until
to
I
get
turn
way
it all
worse.
around.
It's much more likely to get way worse which is like unplayable, hurt, whatever it is. And because we see many more examples of that than the $45 million, oh, he got it all back together here when he's older after injuries. Like that just doesn't really happen in the NBA. So I just don't see a market now. If you're the Nets, I mean, do you look at that situation and you think that Simmons is such a disaster? I mean, I don't know. We'll talk about the Simmons piece of this. The contracts line up to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Although I wonder if like Lavine, I don't even wonder. Lavine is one of these examples of like, is Ben Simmons the worst contract in the NBA? Not anymore. He's not.
Right.
He's just not. It's not a good contract. It's not there's no value on it. It's a negative asset, but it's not the worst contract.
And that's why also throwing in there with Chicago, you have a team and organization telling you they don't believe in your talent. They don't think your talent is worth the money. And you probably have Zach Lavine saying, I'm so much better than what Chicago has afforded me to be, right? All of these things create a very acrimonious departure, what will look like we eventually hear from Chicago. As Doug mentioned, though, coming up next, Ben Simmons for Zach Lavine. What is the upside of that transaction for Brooklyn? And what would be a potential pitfall with 2 and 3 years of money on the books? We'll get into that in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA. I mean, literally winner take all time in the NBA heading into the finals. FanDuel giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers on FanDuel, you're going to get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. It's $150. Bet on spreads, money lines, player props, so much more. Right now, we're heading into the finals. Celtics minus 220 favorites over the Mavs. Kind of like that. I think the Mavs are the nice story here, but Boston's been such a juggernaut all year, probably getting dinged a little bit too, that the road to the East, through the East has been easy. Minus 220 on the Celtics. And is it a hot pick? No. Is it the right pick? Probably. That's what you're going to get over there on FanDuel. You can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. You're going to make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, a friendly reminder that our commitment to doing episodes 5 days a week for you, the people, also involves sometimes being on the road. So if over the course of this episode you see me coming and going a little bit, getting frozen with emotion, that's just internet connections on the road, baby. It's all we can do. Zach Lavine, the contract from a Brooklyn Nets perspective, what's the upside of making this move now in the final year of Ben Simmons' contract in your mind, Doug?
Upside? I mean, the upside, man, I wouldn't use that word. What could be a possible benefit like this year of the Zach Lavine thing is that if you think Simmons is totally dust, that you are going to go, you're in the room with them. You see, I mean, IG workout videos aside, you see that like this year is going to be very similar to last year. You're still sort of in wanting to win now mode. You need another scorer with we've seen like, on ball creation be a real problem for this team and scoring be a real problem for this team. And you say to yourself, Lavine helps us a little bit now, assuming he's healthy. Remember, he was injured last year and it helps us win now and we'll deal with the fallout later. That is about the only case I can make. Because again, just to go back to what we were saying before with Simmons, the great promise around the Simmons contract at this point is that it ends. It's over after this year. Like you're done, clean cap, finished, kaput. It's done. The experiment didn't work. The trade was a failure. They lost it big time. It's been a disaster, but at least it's over after this year. And I think like the Nets are probably just holding tight to that scenario. So it's saddling. because we've seen this thrown out by people like, oh, maybe Lavine, they swap him here, and it's just actually a guy in the room that can actually play. And the Nets were kind of short on guys who could even play last year, right? And so, I think that's like a part you could squint and see it, but for me, it's very obvious that the Lavine contract, the Bradley Beal contract, these are total disasters for these teams, and you just saddling yourself, whichever you're doing, with one of these.
It's just you saddle on.
It's a team killer. It's a team killer. Like, you can't do anything. And to just think about a $50 million player option 3 years from now, I don't know. Get out of the Simmons thing. It didn't work, but don't really consider this kind of move.
Well, this would be we thought Donovan Mitchell, maybe we can't ultimately get him, from Cleveland. He's going to stay there. Okay, fine. And this pivot is a no-cost pivot in terms of assets. You keep all your picks still dry from everything that you got from Phoenix. You say, okay, we're still in the same time frame we are from that standpoint. And then we bring in an encore talent healthy that we think can help our team. I agree with you that I wouldn't make this move or even consider making this move, but this is, if you're the front office and you think you want to be winning now, well, then Zach Lavine could represent a move in the right direction along with Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson. This isn't our philosophy, but it might line up with the way the organization thinks about things over the next, 2 and 3 years.
It's very hard right now to get a handle on like sort of what the Nets plans are, right? Like, I think that this has been a very difficult thing to discern, right? Like, for a while it was stars or bust, right? And it's, we're gonna bring in stars, and stars are guys that Mikal Bridges wants to play next to, and or want to play next to Mikal Bridges, and we're gonna have a clean cap, and Brooklyn's a destination, and all this other stuff. We've heard like surprisingly less of that as this like sort of off season goes on. If you're looking at sort of the spin doctor quotes. And then you look at Jordy Fernandez's staff, which is kind of like trending a little bit more player development, right? I mean, it's got Juwan Howard, but mostly it's a player development approach. And you start to think to yourself, well, I mean, are they like thinking about a pivot here? Like, has the tide kind of turned on like what the plan is? It's just quiet because this is the finals and it's kind of hard to get a sense of where they're going. Are they not sure? I think there's a lot of balls in the air here. I do wonder if things have moved in the NBA a little bit away from where they thought it might go with this group. And now they're maybe positioning themselves to possibly soft reset. I'm not sure. I just wonder. I do think that the quotes around the team have changed a little bit. Like, the tenor has changed a little bit. Like, there's been a little bit more of, rebuild talk. There's been a little bit more of, we'll sign Claxton and then kind of see what happens. There's been, obviously, the Bridges stuff has been floated out there at times, mostly from other teams. I don't know. I think no matter which way you slice it, though, when it comes to Lavine specifically, like, he doesn't fit any of it, right? Like, that contract doesn't fit. If you're trying to be good in 2 years, he doesn't really fit it. If you're trying to be bad now, but not take on more assets or not take on more bad money, he doesn't fit it. So I just think it's just not, it's probably a non-starter.
Yeah, it's weird because I guess if I painted a picture where, again, understand the context I'm putting this in. If I painted a picture where it made sense for Brooklyn to do it, or they're trying to sell themselves on it, it would be that, okay, he's a 25 point a game, night scorer. If healthy, went on the court, you put him in the backcourt with Cam Thomas. That's a really nice dynamic there. And you go ahead and you play out these next 2 or 3 seasons because we believe that our reset is coming in 27, 28, 29. So in a sense, whatever we do from now until then doesn't matter. House money kind of until we get to that place because we're not getting our own picks back, at least as it stands now. That would be the way you look at it as not mattering. The other side of it would be 2025, where you say, but now we do have $45, $49 committed on our cap. We get no more Ben Simmons from a year ago, but we still have big money occupied. Was that the player that we would go and invest in if open market opportunity to sign any free agent that we want, right? So, you can look at it kind of that way, not spending assets and still having opportunities down the road. It really does come down to a little bit short term. What do the Nets want to do when they have a lot of money next year in free agency?
Zach Lavine would be really, if it was Zach Lavine on a 1-year contract and you were trying to be bad, like, that's not the worst guy to bring in, right? If it's 1 year and you're thinking about the 2025 draft because you want to kind of not be that good, but you have a guy who can score and has some highlight reel stuff on his resume, right? And can kind of just put up a high usage, but it can be a little bit of a tank commander. Then I think actually Zach Lavine's not the worst guy in the world, because it's like, I don't know. He has some plays, but you're not really winning much if he's your, 1 or 1A scorer for sure. I mean, that's been proven out over the minutes for him over the Bulls for the last 2 years. But that's just, again, not the situation, because you're tied into the future. These contracts that these teams signed with some of these guys that go out way into the future. And I get why teams do this, by the way. I get it. It's not a good decision, but we've talked many times about how teams' motivations are sometimes different than fan motivations. Teams have to sell tickets. Teams know that not every guy is going to come there in free agency. Teams know that not every draft pick you're going to get is going to be a star. And so at some point, you got to pay and there's a salary floor. You got to pay somebody. And sometimes the guy you have in the building is just a little easier to pay than thinking about going out and finding the guy elsewhere. And that's how you end up with the Zach Lavine contract. That's how you end up with the Bradley Beal contract. That's how you end up with Tobias Harris making a ton of money, right? It's and it being really a bad decision 2 years later. I get it. And you just have to hope that your team isn't in this mode, right? Like, you have to hope that your team doesn't get into this mode, because you just see it sets your franchise back years when you do it. Years. And Levine's like a total test case for that.
Yeah. And that's why, coming up here in a second, not only from a chemistry standpoint inside of the Brooklyn Nets organization, but even from a high level, why philosophically jumping the gun when you hear a name brand player brought up for trades or acquisitions or otherwise almost always comes back to bite the organization in the butt. We'll get into that in just one moment.
All right, let you know the show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Look, we're all carrying around different stressors in our life. It's big, it's small stuff. It all can get to you. It can all build up, especially if you try to press it all the way down. If you're keeping it bottled up, it can really just start to affect you negatively. This is why BetterHelp and therapy is a safe space to get things off your chest and figure out whatever those things are that are weighing you down. And again, remember, it's like sometimes it's the big stuff, sometimes just the small stuff that builds up on us over time. If you're thinking of starting therapy, you got to give BetterHelp a try. It's totally online. It's designed to be convenient. It's completely flexible. It's all 100% suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire. You're going to get matched with a licensed therapist. You switch anytime for no additional charge. BetterHelp wants to find you a therapist that works for you and with you. Get it off your chest with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. You're going to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA.
All right, so as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, talking about Zach Lavine, the potential of the Brooklyn Nets wanting to be in a trade for him, not so likely. Certainly not by this podcast standards. But there's a through thread here about, you mentioned you need to sell tickets, and you do. So you go and you sign guys, maybe, and you pay them more money than you'd like to. But in Chicago, and not unlike in Brooklyn, by the way, too, you have these sample sizes of, but what if fans love even more? Winning basketball, or scrappy basketball, the opportunity of something. Chicago fans are still frustrated with the results there, but they loved supporting the Zach Lavine-less Chicago Bulls because they were a better overall team together. Fans for Brooklyn loved supporting the Spencer Dinwiddie, D'Angelo Russell, Karis LeVert, Jared Allen Nets. Why? Because they were a fun overall team. It's always results-oriented, and those results always get ratcheted up once you bring in and start paying players massive contract. That's you start to hit that, trying to thread the needle, that sometimes the fan base goes, no, thank you. We'd actually prefer you not have brought in these stars if it means this type of result on court.
Yeah, it's always hard right up until you pay the guy too much money. This is what happens every time. It is what happens every time, is that it's all fun when guys are on cheap contracts. Then they are good and they outplay those cheap contracts. And then they're up for the next contract and they want as much money as possible, which, by the way, is correct. Go ahead.
And fans demand you pay them that contract. Like, they don't let him go. Don't let these guys walk out the door. 9 times out of 10, they want you to pay them and keep them there. But then it becomes the results after.
Yeah, right. So then you're a little over leveraged on guys who just aren't good enough, and you just get yourself into a real bind. And I look, there's a complete push and pull when it comes to this stuff, and I admit or I acknowledge that it's very, very difficult from a GM perspective and an ownership perspective, because you want to be competitive, you want to sell tickets, you don't want to lose money, you don't want to bottom out for 10 years. And like, that's just like, that's a really, really hard thing to sell. But it becomes a sort of an existential problem more than anything else, because you are then sort of sometimes negotiating against yourself for these guys that, guys, people have already bought their jerseys. They've already, they've been around for 2 years. Like, they don't want to see that guy go. The jersey becomes worthless when the guy goes out the door. Like, there's other stuff that kind of ends up becoming problematic. The Nets fans are going to see this happen possibly down the line here, right? Like, Bridge is going to be up for a contract. Cam Thomas is up for an extension. We already know Claxton's up for an extension, or excuse me, up in free agency. Like, there are other things coming down the pike here that the Nets will have to deal with themselves around, like what guys are worth on the open market compared to what it's worth keeping you in-house. They just did it with Cam Johnson, arguably overpaid there, right? Like, it's just, it gets super, super tough. You just have to try to avoid it at all costs. And most teams can't. Most teams can't avoid it. Most teams do it eventually, right? It's just a matter of sort of like when, not if.
Remember, Jared Allen traded away at the time. Then he gets a $20 million a year at the time, $100 million contract. And a lot of Nets fans then from far say, what a relief. We wouldn't have paid him that if he had been here then. But, we would have kept him, not for that money. So this is usually GM, but everybody, it's a push and pull across the entire board here for the fan base, for ownership, for GMs. You're always trying to find this right balance. Every single time. It's always results oriented. Pay a massive contract, win a bunch of basketball games. Turns out it was perfect. We're so glad we made that choice. Make massive trades and give away a lot of assets and players to acquire talent. Team falls apart. No championship. What a disaster. They never should have done that. So it always becomes about that. And revisionist history happens too. My last thought would be on, do you think that Donovan Mitchell falls closer to the spectrum of, 2-3 years down the road, not entirely worth it, versus, they should have done that? And that's not about whether or not Mitchell actually become available. It's that level of player that you and I have talked about, right? Maybe not elite superstar, but certainly a very talented player that has mostly a track record of being available.
Oh yeah, he's way better than Lavine.
Yes,
I don't think
sorry. Obviously he's way better than Lavine, but from a money standpoint, right, going forward.
That one's closer. I think you can have a good team with him on the max or close to the max, right? Like, I think that's a team that can still win games. I don't think you're going to be better with him by and large, be better with him off the court than on the court, right? So, he's a dynamic scorer. We see him do it in the playoffs. Like, he checks a lot more boxes, obviously, than Lavine. Yes. Like, big stage playoff performance. Like, he just basically did that. I mean, he got hurt eventually, but like before that, he was good in the playoffs. And I think you can run offenses through him. So I put him on a different level than Lavine for sure. It gets a little tricky with the age, right? Because he's like you sign him to he's a candidate for what can happen next, right? Like, he's a candidate for what can happen next, because he has a player option in age 29. And if you max him at that point, 4 years, let's say, now you're into like age 33, 34 on a combo guard.
Yeah.
And that can go wrong. So it's like now, no. Next contract, maybe. And so these are the guys that sometimes don't age spectacularly. Like, when you lose a little burst, it's a little harder to get to the rim, right? Like, it's a little hard to just sort of shed your man. Then all of a sudden, $50 million for Donovan Mitchell in year 4 or 5. And now we're wash, rinse, repeat on the conversation about like where we are. And that's the other hard part too, because sometimes you pay now, you're like, I'll pay now and I'll deal with the fallout later. Sometimes you get out of it, like with Beal in Washington, with total miracle, they get out of it. Sometimes Lavine, probably not going to get out of it. Right? Like, probably stuck with it. And sometimes you hope to get lucky that the guy can hold on just long enough that some other team doesn't mind doing it because the owner wants to win then. And other times it's just like, sorry, man, you're stuck holding it because you're not getting out of it now.
And all the nonsense aside, with Kevin Durant, you watch Phoenix, you go, maybe the Nets got out of it at all the right times and got immense value. You watch Kyrie Irving, you go, well, if we had a superstar like Luke, it looks like it's the perfect time for Dallas to make that acquisition, the Clippers and Harden, right? So all these things are swirling right around the Brooklyn Nets as it stands in this moment. So you have all these tent poles out there across the NBA to say, right move, wrong move, good decision, bad decision. And to your point, it might feel good right now. And then 2-3 years from now, you're saying, if only we had. So interesting to see how the Nets go ahead and approach this. Obviously, it's just another layer to this offseason for the Nets and for the NBA as the draft approaches. Like by the way, I'll say this last note, some team's going to do it. Some team's going to look at Zach Lavine on a salary dump and say, if he can be healthy, it's going to help our team go from contender to, maybe get into the finals or whatever level you think they want to get to. It probably won't work out, but you'll convince yourself of it and you'll take your shot.
Philly striking out on Paul George could be that team. I still don't think so, because I think Morey's like pretty prudent with this stuff. And I think but that could be a situation where they're like, oh, we just got to do it here. We got a small window on Embiid. There's nobody else available. We can't draft it. And so we just got to go out there and get a guy who can score. Like, I could see that happening. And even that feels a little wish casting. Okay. We are going to get out of here. Much appreciated, everyone rocking with us through the off season here. Hotel internet connections aside, make sure that you are subscribed over on Locked On Nets YouTube. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to the podcast. Go over to WeGotNets.com. We have more coming at you over the offseason and then into the season next year on WeGotNets.com.
I think that success is having fun. Why that is Bruno Mars.
Oh, one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back in tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.